Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture for chapter 11, which is inflammation. And I will tell you, I did I'm not covering every single thing that the book introduces, just so you know. So obviously you're only responsible for what I cover here. Okay, so for the first learning outcome, we're just gonna talk about the complex role that inflammation plays in defending the body from injury and promoting health. So some background information. So as all of the chapters start, just some concepts that are related to inflammation. Okay. So in general, if we talk about inflammation in terms of sort of function and concepts related to it, so protective tissue response to tissue injury or destruction of tissue. So again, a inflammation is meant to be a process to help with that response and to promote sort of healing, right? It says, immunovascular response to the disease-causing organism. Again, if there is some sort of bacteria or virus that's coming into the body, the inflammatory response is gonna occur as a result of that sort of invading organism. Okay, whenever you hear any words ending in itis, that describes an inflammatory process. And again, I'm sure if you just stop and thought for a second, you probably can think of a whole bunch of words that end in itis, appendicitis. There's many words that you can think of. So anything that ends in itis is basically inflammatory process or indicates inflammation. Okay, it says it's not synonymous with infection. Again, an infection is that foreign body, that bacteria, that virus that enters the body, right? That's the infection part of it. That then triggers that immune response. And then that immune response is essentially the inflammation. Okay. All right. So if we take a look at this figure here, again, we have inflammation in the center, and we're going to, we can visualize these sort of primary concepts that are affected by inflammation. And then really on the outside here are all essentially diseases that are associated with inflammation, or excessive inflammation, I should say. Okay. So inflammation can affect oxygenation. And if you're going to think about, inflammation, particularly in the respiratory system, right, leads to things like asthma, pneumonia. Okay. Ards will talk about that as we go through or later on in the chapter. If we're talking about elimination, right, Crohn's disease, colitis. Okay. So you can get an idea of things here. Again, if we're particularly going to talk about perfusion, right, heart failure, atherosclerosis, stroke, those are all things that are going to be related to that concept. Okay. There are also sort of certain inflammatory diseases, right, that are sort of triggered by an infection. So there is some, obviously, so there's an infection that will sort of start that inflammatory process, and then there's sort of this excessive response to it. Okay. So the idea is kind of like there needs to be this sort of second sort of hit to sort of induce that inflammation, then that can lead to disease. Okay. And so that's what this is sort of referring to here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the inflammatory response, okay, in more detail, okay. Two types of immunity, so innate versus acquired immunity, we're going to talk about. So innate immunity is a non-specific type of immunity that's present at birth. You can consider it as your first line of defense in immune response. It will provide protection from exposure to some antigen until an adaptive immune response can sort of kick in. So again, this is the initial kind of first line of defense, okay? Things like redness, swelling, heat, pain, those are all results of innate immune responses, okay? So some components of the innate immune system, right? There's physical barriers. Skin, mucous membranes, mucus itself is a physical barrier. Enzymes in epithelial and phagocytic cells. These are part, and we're going to talk about some of these things will come up again more specifically when we talk about some specific responses. Inflammation-related proteins like C-reactive protein, and I think we talked about, or we had a case study maybe that mentioned C-reactive protein before, but this is something that is measured in the blood, right? And so elevated levels of C-reactive protein indicate inflammation in general, okay? Toll-like receptors are receptors that sit on immune cells that help sense pathogens and sort of start this whole process. So they're kind of like the sort of initiators of an inflammatory reaction. There are other types of cells that will release other inflammatory mediators, right? Like cytokines, and we'll talk about some other types as well. There's also antimicrobial peptides that would be released by cells involved in this process. And then phagocytes are referring to cells that are able to basically engulf things like bacteria and get rid of them. And again, that'll come up as we talk more throughout this chapter as well. Okay, so if we specifically look at acquired immunity, okay, another name for this is adaptive immunity. So now this is something that's continually sort of refined throughout the life of the individual. Anytime you're going to encounter any sort of pathogens or antigens, your body's then going to develop antibodies against those pathogens, right? And so again, and these antibodies are specific to a specific pathogen, okay? So the idea is once you're exposed to that, your body generates these antibodies, and then if you encounter that pathogen again, the body can get rid of it quickly before it causes illness, okay? This is the basis of vaccination, right? You get, an injection of an inoculated virus or something like that, that initiates your body to mount an immune response and to produce antibodies, okay? That then again, if you then are exposed to that pathogen again, your body will be able to get rid of it before it can cause illness, okay? Key cells that are involved in adaptive or acquired immunity are lymphocytes, right? So B and T cells, we've probably heard of those before. B cells are the cells that actually produce antibodies that are like released, okay? And again, those will recognize that pathogen. T cells will directly attack that antigen. So the T cells, you can think of the T cells as almost being like they have an antibody sitting on their cell surface. And so they'll be able to recognize that pathogen or recognize when a pathogen has infected a cell and then get rid of that cell that's been affected. So if you look here, I thought that this picture might be helpful because in terms of showing you the difference between T cells and B cells, okay? So here, T cells, it says they recognize the infected cell and they basically induce that cell to undergo cell death, right? If you think about viruses, they can only survive in a host cell, right? So these cytotoxic T cells, or these T cells in general, is super important because you want to get rid of those cells that have been infected by the virus, okay? They're also important in identifying cancer cells in the body. Again, these are cells that are, you can kind of think of them, and they're not these cells that are abnormal, right? They will identify them and get rid of them, okay? So that's why, cancer does have a large immune component, right? If you have a compromised immune system and these T cells are not able to identify the cancerous cells and get rid of them, right? It's a major problem. If you, on the other hand, look at B cells, these actually release, like I said, these release antibodies that then can inhibit or interfere with the virus binding to the host cell. Okay, so you can kind of see how these are different, okay? But both involved in the adaptive immune response or the acquired immune response, okay? Specificity when we talk about adaptive. T cells and T cells and antibodies released by B cells are specific to a particular pathogen. Okay, if you want to just, compare these two, okay, I think this table is super helpful. So innate immunity versus acquired in terms of line of defense. Remember I said innate immunity is the first line of defense, acquired the second line, okay? In terms of timing, the innate immune response is going to happen right away, okay? For acquired, it's delayed. because the body has to produce these antibodies in response to that antigen, okay? So it takes a while for that to happen, okay? Says here, once acquired immunity to a specific antigen has developed, response is immediate. That means once the body has those antibodies produced that are ready for that specific pathogen, if it's encountered, that will then happen fast, okay? Again, like I said before, for acquired, it's specific. For innate, it's just broad in a general sort of response, okay? Memory, there is no memory in innate, but obviously memory is involved in acquired immunity. I just talked about that a lot. In terms of particular cells that are involved, I will mention some of these cells again as we move through the lecture. And so really you're just responsible for knowing these cell types in relationship to the specific topics that I talk about in the lecture. There kind of is a section of the textbook that really gives, I guess, a more detailed explanation about each one of these different cell types. I sort of skip that because I think I give you enough information as we move through, or in terms of what I want you guys to know for these cell types, okay? So, I mean, the big thing here, if you look at differences between acquired and innate, T cells and B cells are going to be involved in acquired immunity. They are not involved in innate immunity, okay? Mast cells, okay, granulocytes, monocytes, macrophages, basically kind of any other immune-related cell is really involved in innate immunity here, okay? Again, for acquired immunity, what's unique is the B and the T cells, okay? Also the dendritic cells here as well. But you'll see macrophages are involved in both, okay? So again, I wouldn't go too crazy with sort of memorizing this. Like I said, I'll talk about this again. For right now, we want to really, though, understand that B cells and T cells are only involved in acquired immunity, okay? All right. So, the other thing, couple reminders. Make sure you have your review sheet out and you are taking notes on that review sheet as I go through this lecture. Also, there are notes I don't know, I want to say a couple, but maybe more than a couple of these slides to define some of the terms that might be on the slide that are sort of new. So just make sure you take a look at the notes as well as you move through. Okay. So, I mean, I think I kind of talked about all of these things. This is really just putting this in pictorial form. You know, again, showing you exposure to an antigen. We talked about kind of innate immunity as being that first response, right? And that it involves, you know, these things that are pointed out here, right? Physical barriers that try to basically keep that antigen out to begin with, okay? If it does get through, then there's going to be, you know, inflammation or an inflammatory process that is introduced. Toll-like receptors, like I said, sit on these immune cells, and they're the sort of first identifiers of that pathogen, right? So they basically signal to the body there is some sort of pathogen that has entered, and then you have this sort of cascade of other events that occurs, okay? Inflammatory mediators are released, maybe antimicrobial peptides, again, phagocytosis to try to get rid of that pathogen, okay? And again, now, over time or as you know, a little bit later in time, I guess, the adaptive immune response can kick in. Again, remember that this involves the production of specific T cells and antibodies from B cells, again, that are specific to that pathogen, okay? If neither of these processes, these inflammatory processes or these immune processes work, then it could end up leading to death. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about acute versus chronic. So we just were talking about innate versus adaptive immune activity, I guess. Let's now talk about acute versus chronic. And again, I'm sure we know the terms acute and a chronic. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of both of these. So for acute inflammation, right, rapid onset. And it says with prominent systemic symptoms, okay, things like fever, chills, malaise. These are all sort of characteristics of acute inflammation. And again, when we say acute, this is going to go away pretty quickly as well. Another thing that's characteristic, leukocytosis with shift to the left. So leukocytosis is just an increase in the number of white blood cells, Okay. The shift to the left indicates an increase in the number of immature white blood cells. So if you think about, again, this inflammatory response, once a pathogen is encountered and this inflammatory response is initiated, it's going to stimulate more white blood cells to be produced. Okay, so this kind of indicates this sort of initial onset of inflammation, or initial onset of some sort of pathogen entering the body. Okay, local responses that you'll see: swelling, redness, heat, pain. Those are all sort of acute inflammatory responses. Okay. What does this happen as a result, or what causes these things, right? Infections, okay? Tissue injury, right? Again, if you have some injury, you have inflammation, you have redness, you have swelling, right? Response to foreign bodies, again, entering into the body, and then just immune reactions in general, okay? In terms of chronic inflammation, it's going to be defined as persisting for at least 2 weeks. Again, that acute inflammation, I guess I didn't really list that on the slide, but it's short-lived, okay? Chronic inflammation is characterized by elevated lymphocytes, right? Macrophages and monocytes. If we look, do a blood count. It says signs and symptoms are usually less severe than acute inflammation, right? So again, kind of think of like a, I don't know, you broke your ankle or something like that, what that acute inflammatory sort of response is going to cause, right? Lots and lots of swelling and lots of pain. If we're talking about more chronic inflammation, that's what we mean, this sort of less severe signs and symptoms. So some common diseases that involve chronic inflammation: diabetes, right? Atherosclerosis, COPD. These are all sort of chronic inflammatory diseases, okay? And at the end of this chapter, we will give some more examples of inflammatory diseases as well. And again, I'm not going to tell you every single inflammatory disease that exists, because there are too many for us to really go through every single one, okay? Autoimmune disorders, okay? Again, this is sort of, when we talk about autoimmune, an autoimmune response is prompted without any sort of pathogen or foreign body, okay? So it's this inflammatory response that occurs even though there is no sort of foreign threat to the body. Okay, so some examples of autoimmune disorders: MS, multiple sclerosis, right? Systemic lupus, SLE, you see it abbreviated as Hashimoto thyroiditis. Again, itis just means inflammation, so inflammation of the thyroid. And this actually leads to hypothyroidism, right? The thyroid gland eventually becomes unable to produce thyroid hormone. Okay, so some examples there. Again, if we compare the two and we look at some different characteristics of acute and chronic, again, onset and duration: fast onset, relatively short duration; slow onset, lasts at least 2 weeks or more. Okay. In terms of what cells are going to be involved, for acute, neutrophil, increase in neutrophils, but for chronic inflammation, you're going to see an increase in these specific white blood cells here: monocytes, macrophages, and lymphocytes. Okay. Degree of tissue injury, okay. Predominant process: vascular and exudative. I define that later on, so we'll come back to that. Here in chronic inflammation, it says new connective tissue is formed. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And so this is the idea where you have inflammatory processes that are going to damage cells, right, and cause them, to die, maybe, right, become necrotic. And then what happens is, instead of those same cell types, being replaced, connective tissue comes in, right? And so if you have connective tissue in the heart or connective tissue in the lung, that's not going to function as heart or lung tissue, okay? And that's going to affect the function of that organ, okay? Okay. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the acute inflammatory response. Okay, so that was really kind of an overview to compare acute and chronic. So if we talk about acute, right, the function is to protect the organism, right, and to initiate repair, essentially. Okay, if we talk about more specific functions, it will interact with the acquired immune system. Okay. So again, it's the initial response, but it does signal that acquired immune system to start producing antibodies, right? And these T cells to be able to specifically destroy that pathogen, okay? You will have an influx of macrophages and lymphocytes. What will also happen as a result of an acute inflammatory response is processes that will try to prevent further damage of tissue. So, I mean, this is kind of, well, so a couple things, and these are kind of almost along the same lines, right? There'll be processes or mechanisms that will try to dilute the toxins, right, that are produced by that pathogen in general, which would obviously prevent the further damage of tissue. Also, if you think about infection or tissue injury, there's part of this response that will try to wall off the area, okay? And so again, it will basically confine that injured or damaged area so that it doesn't spread further, and then sort of allow the sort of these processes to kind of prep that area for healing, okay? So this is actually, this walling off of the area is something that's actually a problem in like spinal cord injury. So you have a spinal cord injury, right? Cells die, what have you. There's this glial scar that's formed. And what happens though is that because of that scar, you end up not being able to have the axons from other neurons to be able to get to the cells that were there. And so it becomes an issue when you're kind of thinking about regeneration of that area, right? So anyway, the reason for it though is to keep that injury or that infection confined to a certain area. But it can itself sort of create other issues, as I just mentioned. Okay, so what are some cell types, right, and cellular events that are involved in this inflammatory response? And again, this is for the acute response, okay? So again, many different cell types are involved. If we talk about, leukocytes, that's just a white blood cells in general, okay? So for the most part, we're talking about different types of white blood cells, okay? So 3 major types of white blood cells: lymphocytes, granulocytes, and monocytes, okay? I already mentioned lymphocytes, right? These are T cells and B cells, also natural killer cells. Those are another type of lymphocytes as well, okay? So remember, T cells, B cells, these natural killer cells are predominantly involved in that acquired immune response. Granulocytes are examples are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, mast cells. Those are types of granulocytes. Okay. Obviously monocytes include monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. Remember, these macrophages are cells that are phagocytic, right? That can actually engulf a bacteria and destroy it, okay? All right, so if you take a look at this figure, it just gives you a little more information, kind of just some of those cells that I mentioned on the other slide, right, in terms of what they're doing. So again, if we're talking about kind of a wound here, right? So this is the surface of the skin. There's some sort of injury, right? Wound. And what you can see here, because it's showing you also platelets here that are going to release blood clotting proteins around that wound site, right? Mast cells will secrete factors that mediate dilation and constriction of the blood vessels. So mast cells will affect the those blood vessels, okay? Neutrophils particularly will secrete factors that will kill or degrade pathogens, right? Remember, I also mentioned that macrophages will remove pathogens by phagocytosis. So whenever you see macrophage, think about phagocytosis, and it's the idea that that cell can actually engulf that bacteria and basically get rid of it, okay? Macrophages also secrete cytokines, and then those cytokines, right, will then attract other immune system cells, okay? So the signals that are released here by the macrophages basically aid in recruiting other cells to this injury site, okay? So you can kind of see how these initial cells come in, and then there's sort of this cascade of events to basically get more immune cells to that area so that we can try to promote this healing process, okay? You can also see, some of these things that are secreted, right? They enter into the bloodstream so that, again, they can go longer distances to recruit some of these cells. They also go into the blood vessel because they will lead to constriction or dilation of that blood vessel as well. So if you're dilating the blood vessels, this is going to allow more immune cells to get to this area, more easily. Okay. All right. So what are some of these chemical mediators? And some are actually shown here, right? Cytokines, but let's talk a little bit more about them. And what do we mean by mediators, right? So chemical mediators are actually secreted by cells, right? They also can be produced by plasma proteins. So think about them as circulating through the blood in an inactive form. And then once they encounter some other molecule, they're then induced to become one of these chemical mediators, okay? So in terms of cell-derived mediators, okay, it says they're maintained in intracellular granules. Bottom line is they're maintained inside the cell, right, inside immune cells, and they will be released, right, or produced in response to tissue injury. So if they're sitting there ready to go, they'll immediately be released, okay? So like we showed this here, right, these macrophages releasing these cytokines. They're usually short-lived, okay, but they can stimulate the release of other mediators, like I said when I was showing you that diagram, which will further amplify this response, okay? So some specific, a little bit more specific examples. So macrophages, dendritic cells, mast cells will secrete histamine, are sort of the primary cell types that will release these mediators, okay? So histamine, you probably heard of histamine before, right? When you think about allergic responses, it's going to involve histamine. Histamine will result in vasodilation and also increase vascular permeability, because again, you want to get these immune cells to that tissue, to that area where the wound is, right? So it's increasing that vascular permeability to allow those cells to enter that area. An example of a lipid mediator, again, comes from a cell though, are prostaglandins. Those are also involved in vasodilation, okay? Some examples of cytokines will be shown on the next slide in table 11.3, so I'll talk about them in a second. So I mentioned the plasma protein. There are these plasma protein systems. I'm not going to give you specific examples. The book goes through the three sort of main examples, but I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. And so you sometimes refer to these as cascades, because again, each component is sort of sequentially activated. So it's the idea, again, that there will be these proteins circulating in the blood, but they're in an inactive form, okay? They are only activated in response to inflammation. So again, think about that initial response that's sort of happening here. Some of these signals that are released will enter into the blood vessels and then could activate some of those plasma protein systems, okay? All right, so this is sort of the two main types of chemical mediators, or where these chemical mediators come from. They can come from cells directly, but also from plasma proteins as well. Also a reminder, and again, I could have included more detail here, but I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. HPA axis, right? Remember we talked about this in our stress chapter. Hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. Again, when you think about it as being induced by, stress, that adrenal gland will release cortisol, okay? Cortisol is a type of glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids in general, cortisol in general, suppress immune activity. So these have so cortisol has an anti-inflammatory effect. So again, this is the idea that, there are other systems or molecules in the body that will interact with the inflammatory process, right? Some things that might stimulate inflammation more, or things that can help, that would suppress it, okay? All right, so as I said, these are just some examples of different cytokines, okay? And where they mostly come from. So TNF alpha, this really should be an alpha, not an A. IL-1, there's also IL-1 alpha and beta, IL-6, IL-17. These are cytokines, and we've probably heard of cytokines before. And again, all they are chemical mediators. They're immune molecules, right, that are released by immune cells. And so again, TNF alpha primarily by macrophages and mast cells, okay? If you want to talk about primary action, it's listed here, okay? So TNF alpha involved in fever, okay? IL-6 also plays a major role in mediating fever as well, okay? And you can see that macrophages are going to release all of these different cytokines here. IL-17 is one that's particularly released by T lymphocytes, and it is pro-inflammatory and can be associated with allergic reactions. So I think it's important to be familiar with some of these cytokines that are listed here. Again, this cytokines in general, I guess, are sort of a main or a major sort of field of study within relation to many different types of diseases, including, neurological diseases. Okay. So, I mean, and obviously you talk about them a lot when you're talking about injury, right? Traumatic brain injury being one thing, but they are definitely, it's definitely a class of molecules that is studied a lot right now. Okay, so moving on. So it says, discuss the primary morphologic types of acute inflammation and the 4 possible outcomes of acute inflammation. So we're still talking about acute inflammation here. And so here are these different morphological types of inflammation, of acute inflammation, okay? And we should be familiar. So if we're talking about serous inflammation, okay, the fluid that's going to accumulate doesn't contain many cells, usually results from tissue injury. If we say something is exudative, we mean it contains proteins, okay? Again, generally not too severe. An example of this is a blister that's formed by a burn, okay? And, if you think about what fluid is in there, it's usually pretty clear, right? Contains some proteins, but not much else. We talk about fibrinous inflammation, okay? This results from increased vascular permeability. So what do we mean by increased vascular permeability? We're talking about the blood vessels, right? And that the permeability is going to be increased. Therefore, large proteins that normally would not get out of those blood vessels can leak out of the vessels into the tissues, okay? This is more severe than serous inflammation. An example is fibrinous pericarditis. And I did, just to show you, add a little footnote in here in terms of what this is, okay? So it affects, obviously, the pericardium. If we say pericarditis, it's inflammation of the pericardium. And basically it ends up with these fibrous adhesions. And again, it's caused by this type of inflammation, okay? Can happen as a result of trauma, surgery, also heart attack, okay? So there are some, so anyway, just to remind you that there are some notes here and to check the notes as you move through the lecture. Okay. Purulent or suppurative, right? Inflammation. Pus, right? Formation of pus containing many neutrophils, cellular debris, and edema, right? Or fluid. So there's lots of stuff inside of that fluid. So it says it'll occur if the pathogen is difficult to eliminate or severe. So you see this with Staphylococcus. Another example is with appendicitis. Okay. Something else that can occur is ulceration. Okay. So again, this is more severe, right? Very severe inflammation. This is really going to be caused by necrosis of cells, right? So cells dying. An example is gastric ulceration. I'm sure we've heard of ulcers. You probably usually associate an ulcer with the GI tract. And what can happen is that acute ulcer can actually be replaced with connective tissue. If it gets replaced with connective tissue, again, that connective tissue doesn't really belong there. It's not going to function as like the tissue that belongs there. Okay. So that can then lead to a chronic ulcer. All right. So some factors that will, be involved in determining the outcome of inflammation, right? It can be resolved, right? So resolution, healing of the injury, there's no permanent destruction. So if you just think about recovery from a common cold, recovery from a minor, scrape or some other type of, contusion or something like that. If you talk about fibrosis formation, you can get scarring, okay? Significant tissue damage. What happens in scarring is those epithelial cells are replaced by fibroblasts. Again, it's the idea that you have a different cell type replacing what was there. Can impair physical function. If you think about myocardial infarction, a heart attack, again, what happens is those heart muscle cells die. Instead of new heart muscle cells can't replace them. And so it's fibroblast cells that will replace them. They do not function as heart cells. Okay, so you lose the function of those cells that were there. You can have an abscess that might form. Usually this is caused by bacteria. And then there's a cavity that contains pus. You'll have redness and edema that will extend around that abscess. Okay. Again, if that acute inflammation is not resolved, it can lead to chronic inflammation. And we're going to talk more about chronic inflammation in a second. Okay. This is really, again, just a picture of what I showed you, what I just talked about on the last slide, showing you resolution, fibrosis, abscess formation, and then chronic inflammation here. Okay. So, again, you can just kind of take a look at this. I don't think I need to go through this. Again, I mean, I guess, I could show you this picture on the exam and maybe ask you about these different types of outcomes. I guess the idea is just as long as you're familiar with what's presented here in this chart, you're probably fine. Okay. Just really another way of showing it. Okay. Moving on, we're going to talk about chronic inflammation. Okay. So we already said that it's defined as inflammation that lasts more than 2 weeks. Okay. What are some causes? Unresolved, right? Like we just said, if we're talking about this acute process, if it's unresolved, it can end up being chronic inflammation. Also, repeated acute infections that maybe do get resolved may then end up leading to chronic inflammation. Autoimmune disease is definitely a cause of chronic inflammation. Okay. Again, it's caused by excessive and inappropriate response of the immune system. There is no pathogen there for it to respond to. However, the immune response has been activated. Examples, right? Rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis are examples of autoimmune diseases. May also result from an unregulated response to a microbe. So, like inflammatory bowel disease. I don't know that that doesn't belong under autoimmune. Sorry. I guess that this belongs out here. That's misleading the way that that's written. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So let's fix that there. Okay. Can also result from an unregulated response to a microbe, right? So there's some sort of, again, a microbe that will induce it, and it leads to this chronic inflammation. Okay. So so inflammatory bowel disease may originate that way. If you think about an environmental trigger, right? Environmental allergens can trigger asthma. Okay. Asthma is caused by inflammation. Okay. Also, prolonged exposure to irritants can cause chronic inflammation as well. So it can be exogenous or endogenous. So one example here is silicosis, results from chronic inflammation of airways due to exposure of silica. And silica is something that is present in building materials. And so, people that work in sort of that maybe manufacturing type of industry, and maybe aren't wearing the proper protective equipment, maybe, could experience this. Okay. Just to give you an example. Okay. So in chronic inflammation, right? What type of, so it says morphologic types and cells involved. Okay. So I guess this is really mostly, cells involved, I guess. Let me just see something. Let me just see if I missed something in terms of that title. I think the title is a little bit of, there's not really, okay, yeah. Remember we talked about for the acute, when we were talking about the morphologic types, we're talking about the serous inflammation, fibrinous inflammation. For chronic, we're not going to have those examples to talk about, okay? So this is really pertaining to the morphologic type. So infiltration of macrophages and lymphocytes, right, will occur. Instead of neutrophils in acute inflammation. And it will be associated with tissue destruction and replacement of that damaged tissue with fibrous tissue, okay? In terms of the cells involved, I guess that's sort of one thing that I want you, again, to be aware of here in terms of some main functions of some of these different types of white blood cells, okay? Macrophages, like I said, macrophages always think about phagocytosis. They also will secrete cytokines, right? So again, phagocytosis is engulfing some foreign material, okay, like a bacteria. Lymphocytes, right? Autoimmune and other hypersensitivity disorders, lymphocytes will be involved. Eosinophils, I think I might have spelled that wrong. Yikes. No, I didn't. Okay. Those are particularly involved in hypersensitivity disorders and also parasitic infections as well. Mast cells, allergic reactions, right? Response to venom. I told you that mast cells produce histamine. You think about histamine in allergic reactions. Neutrophils are primarily involved in the acute response, but they still do play a little bit of a role in chronic inflammation as well. Okay? Okay. So something else to talk about is something called oh my gosh, I can't even say it. Granulomatous. Maybe if it wasn't Friday at 4 p.m., I would be able to pronounce that. Inflammation, and we're going to talk about outcomes of inflammation. Okay, so this is a distinct type of chronic inflammation characterized by the formation of granulation tissue. Okay, and this can be a result or is a result of a protective response, okay, to injury, right, like chronic infection or some sort of foreign body, okay? So there are a couple types of diseases that are characterized by this type of inflammation. So tuberculosis, histoplasmosis, syphilis, sarcoidosis, and also exposure to asbestos, okay? So again, I'm pretty sure I put some notes in here, okay, to just clarify this a little bit more, okay? So it says granulation tissue is new connective tissue, okay, and microscopic blood vessels that form of that wound during the healing process, okay? And then again, just to clarify what sarcoidosis is, okay, and also histoplasmosis, okay? So you guys can take a look at that, but just further clarifies or defines some of those terms that are on this slide. The 3 cell types that are primarily involved in this type of inflammation, okay, are listed here. And again, let me just fix this because this should be tabbed in. So we're going to fix that here. So the 3 cell types, right, are epithelioid, okay, which consists of macrophages, but that are similar to epithelial cells, so hence the name there, okay? Sorry, let's go back here. Another type of cell, and again, these are cell types that I haven't talked about, right? So I think, again, worth mentioning because they're different, they're different than what we talked about before. There are these multinucleated Langhans or giant cells, and these basically result from a combination of a macrophage and an epithelioid cell, okay? Also, lymphocytes are involved that will help form a ring around that granuloma, okay? And that it sort of can kind of, again, if that ring is formed around there, it kind of keeps it confined to that area. All right, outcomes of chronic inflammation, right? Again, I think this is pretty obvious. It can obviously lead to significant health problems, right? Inflammatory bowel disease. Can also lead to colon cancer as well, okay? So let's talk about systemic inflammation. Okay, what are some indicators of systemic inflammation? Okay, fever, right, or pyrexia. And what, in terms of kind of what we know and of how fever is induced, right? Result of cytokines that are released by neutrophils and macrophages. These are known as endogenous pyrogenes, right? So again, they're sort of inducing the fever, right? And they're endogenous because they're produced from inside the body. And so these will stimulate synthesis and release of prostaglandins, okay? And then the prostaglandins sort of will directly interact with the hypothalamus to kind of induce the fever, but it's the cytokines that are sort of initiating that process. So cytokines are involved in the fever, okay? Also, if we're talking about systemic inflammation, right? How do we know that there is some sort of inflammation going on, okay? Fever is one of them, right? An increase in serum proteins, right? So again, one of the common ones is C-reactive protein. So if we looked in the blood and we saw elevated levels of C-reactive protein, it indicates that there is inflammation that's going on, okay? And again, these are stimulated by cytokines as well. Okay, so some other examples, fibrinogen, serum amyloid are also two other examples of serum proteins, serum inflammatory proteins, I guess. Okay. Leukocytosis, what does that mean? Elevated white blood cell count, okay? Normal range, about 4,000 to 10,000. Counts around, 15,000 to 20,000 indicates inflammation, okay? If you look specifically at the types of white blood cells, right? If you see increased neutrophils, it indicates acute inflammation. If you see increased monocytes, it indicates chronic inflammation. If we see increased eosinophils, it indicates an allergic reaction, okay? So you can look at those specific white blood cells, and that gives you a little more information in terms of what's going on more specifically. Okay, so again, here's a table, and this table spans across 3 slides. We are not going to memorize this, but again, thinking about what are some potential causes of a high count and also versus a low count, okay? Some terms here too. So if we look at neutrophils specifically, right? High count, neutrophilia, right? Low count, neutropenia, okay? And so here are some examples of things that would cause an increase in neutrophils, okay? Here are some examples of things that will cause a decrease in neutrophils. I don't need to read through these for you, okay? Lymphocytes, right? Again, lymphocytosis, lymphopenia, okay? Take a look at some of these examples here. Moving on, again, particularly with monocytes, eosinophils, okay? Again, as we said with eosinophils, allergies, right? Allergic reactions, parasitic infections. So you can see how assessing these specific white blood cells will help indicate what's going on, okay? And then obviously there's going to be further testing done, but just knowing which type of white blood cell is increased or decreased can give you a lot of information, okay? Again, basophils, okay? You see this in rare allergic reactions, okay? Again, basophilia or basopenia, okay? Okay, there is something that's called systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or SIRS, okay? And basically it's a severe systemic response to inflammation, or a severe systemic inflammatory response. When it's due to some sort of infection, we call it sepsis, okay? Super dangerous. Other causes of this, pulmonary embolism, okay? So right, that's a blood clot in the lung, in the pulmonary vessel somewhere. Anaphylaxis, right? Adrenal insufficiency. These all can cause this severe inflammatory response, okay? Can lead to shock, multiple organ failure. Like I said, super dangerous. It says here 2 of the following criteria must be met to diagnose SIRS. Body temperature, that's too low. Body temperature, that's too high. Heart rate increase, respiratory rate increase, and then obviously looking at that white blood cell count. Okay. So what are some potential causes and consequences of impaired and excessive inflammation? Okay. So remember, again, inflammation is a normal response to tissue injury, right? But when it becomes excessive or prolonged, it can cause disease, okay? What is it characterized by? We just went through all this, right? Excessive pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then that leads to damage to tissues, okay? There have been many studies that have indicated, right, that overproduction of cytokines like TNF-alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta are associated with many inflammatory diseases, okay, like respiratory distress syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis, and also inflammatory bowel disease. So like I said, there is a lot of research that goes on, with cytokines in particular, okay? And there are many, many different types of cytokines, right? Some that are pro-inflammatory, also some that are actually anti-inflammatory, okay? Again, when we talk about autoimmune, this is going to develop when the body mounts an inflammatory response to normal tissue, okay? And usually it's organ or tissue specific. I guess there's some suggestions that impaired clearance of apoptotic cells or apoptotic cells can actually contribute to an autoimmune response. But to be honest, I think we really don't know what's causing we really don't know what causes autoimmune responses. Okay, so let's talk about some key disorders in which inflammation is really a major contributing factor. Okay, Alzheimer's disease. We probably usually don't think of it as an inflammatory disease. And again, there are probably tons and tons, or not probably, there are tons and tons of other diseases I could mention here. Okay, we're just giving some examples. All right, so Alzheimer's, right? We all know it's a type of dementia. You get accumulation of something called beta amyloid. These proteins coagulate together and they form these plaques. That leads to also these tangles. So you have these plaques and these tangles in the brain, which ends up causing neurons to die, interferes with signaling, and neuroinflammation is believed to be involved, right? Primarily, immune cells of the brain called microglia are believed to be major contributors to Alzheimer's disease. Okay, asthma, another one, right? Chronic airway inflammation. Okay. Atherosclerosis. Okay, I've talked about this. I feel like I talked about it a couple times, right? In the fact that, we think about atherosclerosis as being, just lipid buildup in the blood vessels, but it has a lot to do with inflammation. Okay, so it says here that it's believed to be a chronic inflammatory response, right, of both innate and acquired immunity. Basically white blood, right, leukocytes, mostly monocytes and macrophages, to that LDL, that low density lipoprotein that basically accumulates in the walls of arteries. So once you have too much of that LDL around and accumulating in the arteries, it leads to that inflammatory response. Okay. Others, again, depression. Maybe we don't really think about it as inflammatory, but the idea here is just to sort of raise awareness that there have been studies that have indicated there are more pro-inflammatory cytokines present in patients that have depression. Okay, I don't know that anyone would call it, just label depression as an inflammatory disease, but the idea is that inflammation or chronic inflammation has been associated with depression. Okay. Diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes, inflammaging, okay, which is something, what it is just chronic low-grade inflammation that's just associated with aging, okay? One thing that happens is you get impairment of the gut. And so that can kind of contribute to this, okay? So, and again, it could just be just regular normal aging of the cells, and that these immune cells, aren't functioning as well as they should. And so you just end up with this sort of low-grade inflammation that doesn't really go away. Obesity, again, we talked about obesity and its relatedness to inflammation, and here it is again. Okay, last part of this, right? Some primary treatments for inflammation. Okay, so again, the treatment is going to depend on the underlying cause. Obviously, if we're kind of talking about just acute inflammation, you're going to want to decrease the redness, the swelling, the pain, the heat, right? And so a sort of general protocol for tissue injury is RICE, right? Rest, ice, compression, and elevation. It suggests here that mild mobilization rather than complete rest might actually be more beneficial. The idea of trying to move around. So if you injure your ankle, obviously you're not going to go run a marathon on it, but moving it around and keeping that blood circulating there and that movement actually will help with the healing process. Some medications that are used to treat inflammation on the next slide, these will be described a little bit more. Aspirin, acetaminophen, NSAIDs, right? Non-steroidal. Where are we? Yeah. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. COX inhibitors and prednisone. Okay, so let's look at these in a little more detail on this slide. So again, here are some, COX inhibitors, right? NSAIDs, acetaminophen, aspirin, and prednisone. In terms of actions, right, for each one of them. Okay. Says here too, medications that target specific mediators. that wasn't listed on my last slide. But if you think about specifically, like specific treatments for rheumatoid arthritis, okay? There are treatments like that out there, okay? These other ones are general, are drugs that are used to treat general inflammatory process, okay? And then this is just giving you some precautions with some of these here, okay? So again, I same thing here. We don't really need to memorize this table. And if you look, it's really sort of redundant. Obviously, we label these as anti-inflammatories, right? Some of these are also analgesics. Actually, most of them are, okay? Meaning that they're going to suppress pain, right? Pain suppressors. This antipyretic is basically decreasing fever, okay? So, but again, there's going to be some overlap here. For prednisone, okay, this is particularly anti-inflammatory, and it really will directly, it's a steroid, it's going to directly suppress immune activity in general, okay? So this is really only given in certain specific and really serious types of inflammation, okay? All right, that's it, guys. So again, make sure you have that review sheet out. You're completing that review sheet. You take a look at all the notes that I have in the slides as well.